Today I'm building this walnut nightstand, and I'm going to go in depth on my method of how I cut the miters so the grain flows around the corners and all four miters fit perfectly the first time. So let's get into it. This build starts off like any other, cutting to length, milling to thickness, and joining edges, with one exception. I'm keeping the bores for the sides and top as one length to help ensure the grain matches on the mitered corners. I'll cut them apart after I do the glue up. Once I got everything milled to thickness and edge jointed, I used some floating tenons to help keep everything aligned during glue up. After the glue is dry, I cut the sides and top to length. I labeled each piece to keep track of where it goes in the project so I don't end up with a mismatched grain pattern. When I lined up the track saw, I took my time to be sure I was cutting 90 degrees to the edge. This is especially important because if you're off and need to make a second cut to straighten it out, you risk messing up the grain to match on the corners. The more material you remove, the worse the match will be, until the two ends get so far away from each other they no longer match at all. Now that I cut them to length, I cut them to their final width, making sure I oriented them so I was always ripping off the back edge. To prep the workpieces to be mitered, I milled some scrap pine wood and edge jointed it so I would have a straight edge to guide my workpieces. I used some CA glue to attach them. I butted both pieces against the table saw fence to ensure the edges would line up. Once they were prepped, it was time to set the saw up to cut the miters. First I set up a sacrificial fence I could screw to. Then I used a scrap piece milled to the same thickness as the nightstands to set the height of my auxiliary fence and screwed it in place. I made sure my scrap piece slid snugly underneath the auxiliary fence. Then I glued on a runner to ride along the auxiliary fence as I did before. Now setting the blade is the most important part. I took the time to adjust it so it cuts at a perfect 45 degrees. Then I raised the blade so the outside of the tooth just kisses the outside of the edge of the auxiliary fence. I ran my test piece to be sure it was right to the edge, no more, no less, and at a perfect 45 degrees before running the rest of the pieces. Once all the pieces were mitered, all it took was a couple of taps from a mallet to remove the pine strips. Since glue alone in a miter joint isn't that strong, I used some floating tenons to reinforce the joint. If you don't have a Festool domino, you can easily jig up a router to make your mortises. Before I do the final glue up, I cut a dado on the back edge to accept the back panel. Walnut plywood is crazy expensive and I need less than a half of a sheet for this project, so I used some 1/4 inch birch ply as a core and resawed some walnut to veneer over it. I cleaned up the edges, taped them together, applied a little glue, and threw it in the veneer bag. While the bag sucked tight, I made sure nothing had slipped and everything was still lined up. Finally ready for assembly. I used some CA glue to attach some clamping blocks to the edges to give me something to clamp to, then flip them over to apply the glue. Prior to glue up, I did pre-finish the inside faces and taped off the edges so I wouldn't get any squeeze out on the finish. There are a lot of floating tenons and edges to apply glue to, so I gave myself a little extra working time and used a slow set epoxy to do the glue up. The top piece took a little convincing to get in place, but a little brute force and some help with a few parallel clamps, it popped right in place. Sort of. I measured the diagonals to be sure it was square and let the glue set up so I can knock off the glue blocks and move on to cutting the decorative bevel on the front. I put my sacrificial fence back on and elevated it slightly above the blade. This created some space between the blade and the fence so the cutoff would not get trapped and reduce the chance of kickback. The angle and height of the blade is just an arbitrary number determined by a few test cuts on some scrap wood. I adjusted it until I found an angle I thought looked good that day, then muscled up the case on the table saw and cut the bevel. To create the legs, I laminated up some 8/4 lumber and milled it square. I set a stop on my miter gauge to cut them to length. The pieces were so short and the blade was so tall, I opted to clamp each piece to the miter gauge as I cut them. To cut the mortises for the floating tenons, I screwed some scrap plywood to the table to make a quick jig to hold the small pieces and plunged away, cutting 2 mortises per leg. Then for the corresponding mortises, I did a little layout on the bottom of the nightstands, and while standing on my assembly table, I cut the mortises for them. While trying to keep track of which side had the mortises, I marked out for the decorative angle to be cut on the legs. I sliced the angles off with the bandsaw. I used a little blue tape to hold the cutoff on until I cut the opposing angle. It seemed a little safer that way. Then clean the saw marks up at the disc sander before gluing them in place. To make the drawers, it was back to prepping the material. I took my time at the joiner to be sure I had a good square edge. It makes it a lot easier to fit the drawers in the opening if everything is nice and square. To cut the dovetails in the drawers, I used the Lee J dovetail jig. It may be a bit complicated to use, but well worth the time to figure out if you're doing any kind of production work. Then I set up my dado stack to run a dado for the bottom panel. I set it up so it would pass between the pins of the drawer front and through the lower tail of the drawer sides. This way, when it is put together, you don't see the dado and I don't have to deal with chopping a stop dado on the ends. I find it easier to cut the drawer sides a little long, then cut them to final length after cutting the dovetails. This way I don't have to compensate for the length of the tail before it's cut. I can do a test fit of the drawer and measure exactly how much to cut off the sides. Then I cut rabbets in the end of the drawer sides to accept the back. And do another dry assembly to measure the length for the drawer backs. Once I have all the parts cut out, I add some glue to the dovetails, tap them together, slide the back in place, and use a pin nailer along with some glue to install the backs. No matter how careful I am, there is always an edge of the drawer that is not perfectly flush, but it's nothing I can't fix with a few strokes of a hand plane. I'm using Bloom self-closing drawer glides for this project. They seem complicated to install, but all you really need is their setup jig. Use the same jig to pre-drill all the holes. There are 2 in the back of the drawer for the alignment pin. Then switch to a smaller drill bit and turn the jig sideways to pre-drill for the screws to attach the drawer glide to the drawer bottom. It's that simple. To install the drawer glides inside the nightstand, I cut 2 spacers the correct height out of some scrap plywood. I rested the glide on the spacers while I pre-drilled and screwed them in place. I then moved them to the other side to ensure I have the glides installed at the same height. I did the same thing for the middle glide and then rested the bottom glide on the bottom of the cabinet while attaching it. All you have to do now is just drop the drawers on the hardware and they click right in place. Now I just need some finish on my drawer fronts. Thank you for making it all the way through the project. If you want to see more cool builds like these, please join me on Patreon. The more people that hang out over there, the cooler the projects I'll be able to build in the future. And of course, please subscribe and hit the bell to get notified when the next video comes out.